Chapter 4 Via Hayes, Paraguay, 2001. Suzanne Krieger. Sarah Connor, she thought. In my previous pre-Terminators, pre-Change the Future existence, finished signing the contract with a flourish and tipped her chair back, taking a quick look out into the garage, through the grimy streaked glass of the office window. One of her company's trucks had its hood up and its guts laid out, but nobody seemed to be around. She slid open the second drawer of her desk and slipped out a flask of cognac. Suzanne unscrewed the cap and added a healthy dollop of the cane alcohol to her tirere, an iced mate drink she'd grown fond of. It went down even smoother with a little help. It also made her sweat a little, but everyone did that in the Chaco. Summers here ran over 100 every day, and it wasn't a dry heat either. "Senora," a weary voice said. There was a hint of censure in it. Sarah's mouth twisted in exasperation, and she looked over at Ernesto Jaramillo, her chief mechanic. His broad, mustachioed face was set, his dark eyes sad. "Where the heck did you come from?" she asked defensively. "A second ago there wasn't anybody around." She stubbed out her cigarette impatiently. "It's not even 11 o'clock in the morning, senora," Ernesto pointed out. "What's an hour or so among friends?" she asked, turning to her work. "Did you want something?" "That stuff will rot your liver," he said. Rotten liver. Sounds like a happy condition." Sarah adjusted her ashtray, then turned over a paper and signed the one beneath it. "Did you want something, Ernesto?" She gave him a sidelong glance. He shrugged, frowning. "I just want you to be healthy, senora," he grumbled. She turned and looked squarely at him. "Thank you, Ernesto. I know you mean well, but I'm not doing anything wrong here. The business isn't going to fail because I like flavoring my tea with cognac." She smiled at him. He smiled back, shaking his head. Then he shrugged. "I just came to tell you that Melinda is going to take her break in about 5 minutes. "Thanks," Sarah said. "I'll be there in a second." He lifted his hand in a sort of salute and wandered off. Suzanne, watched him go, then took another sip. "Can't believe the way I pussyfoot around people these days," she thought. Not so very long ago, she'd have told Ernesto what he could do with his fatherly concern, but there was no help for it if she was to blend in. Paraguayan culture required women to be mild and somewhat subservient. She was cutting edge here, just for being the boss. Milquetoast that I am. Sarah stood and smoothed down her narrow dark shirt, then checked her hair in the mirror. Even now, her appearance sometimes surprised her. The short, dark brown haircut close around her face and the big, heavy frames of her fake glasses made her look more fragile somehow. But the darkness of her hair brought out the blue of her eyes with surprising intensity. She was feminine enough to still like that. It made up a little for the ugly glasses, a necessary disguise that kept people at a distance. Outside of work, she wore sunglasses, always, except at night, of course. But since she never went anywhere at night, it didn't matter. Sometimes her lack of a social life bothered her. With John away in school, it was lonely out on her little estancia. But as a single mother, a businesswoman, and a foreigner, people around her genuinely didn't know what to make of her. They avoided any discomfort by avoiding her. Not that that stopped them talking, of course. This place had the small-town vices in spades. Sometimes she thought it was just as well. Sometimes she worried that she would be more involved, with something feminine like a bake sale for charity or something. After all, her trucking company sponsored a local baseball team, which was a very popular move, but somehow the locals had persuaded themselves that it was her workers who sponsored the team, rather than herself. It came down to her gender again. If she had been born male, she would have been absorbed into this town years ago. She also handled more than a little of the local smuggling market. Sarah had expected people to suck up to her a bit because of that, but it turned out that was also a strike against her. Smuggling was man's work, as were trucks. Her story of inheriting the business from her husband was the only thing that had made it possible for her to get along at all here. The local women were very nice to her, but kept their distance. Even Melinda was no more than politely friendly. Sarah had once been checked out by a local widower who was essentially looking for an unpaid housekeeper nanny that he could boink without censure, but she'd run him off as quickly as she could. She knew she'd have killed the man in a week, leaving 7 little big-eyed orphans behind. Then I'd have felt obligated to raise the little monsters. Once in a while, she considered selling up and moving to Asadine to become a secretary or even a waitress, but then she'd remember the peace and quiet of her estancia and Linda, her mare, and she'd put it out of her mind. Changing locations wouldn't change who she was anyway. It wasn't just that she was a foreigner and a woman that kept people away. Sometimes when she was tired or not thinking, and sometimes deliberately, she radiated danger and distrust. With a half smile, Sarah put down her brush and fluffed her bangs. Funny, that's just what makes the smugglers trust me. She added a touch of lipstick. Her mouth was the same, still the full lower lip, but now it was bracketed with what she chose to refer to as smile lines. Not that anyone would want to see the smile that could produce such marks. Sarah walked into the front office with her drink and her cigarettes to find Melinda browsing a magazine instead of filing the massive stack of invoices at her elbow. Sarah suppressed a sigh. She'd fire the girl in a New York minute, except that Melinda was a vast improvement over the previous 2. Being a known smuggler kept many families from allowing their daughters to work for her, including the families of smugglers. She was lucky to have anyone. Tapping out a cigarette, she smiled at her employee. "Oh, thank you for coming, Senora. See you in 15 minutes, Melinda said cheerfully. She picked up her pocketbook and magazine and flitted out the front door. 15 minutes. Right. Sarah lit up and took a drag of her cigarette. Picking up the stack of invoices, she took them over to the filing cabinet. I'll be lucky if she makes it back in time to go to lunch. Ernesto had told her that there was an apparently serious flirtation going on between Melinda and a boy who worked at the Confitena down the street. And serious flirting took time. I wonder if she'll be getting married soon. If so, Sarah would soon be in the market for another receptionist. She dreaded the prospect. There was something behind her. Sarah continued to place invoices in their files as she tried to sense something about the mysterious presence. It didn't smell like one of the mechanics or drivers, no sharp scent of gas or oil. She heard the whisper of fabric, of slacks or jeans, making it probable the intruder was a male. He moved young, and then she knew. "Hi, John," she said, smiling. "How do you do that?" he demanded. "I could have sworn I didn't make a sound." She turned, still smiling, and opened her arms to him. When he stepped into her hug, she blinked to find her chin resting on his shoulder. "Whoa," she said, holding him off. "You've grown." "I'm 16, Mom. It happens." He looked smug as he said it. Sarah looked him over, shaking her head. There was a lighter mark on the cuffs of his school uniform jacket where the sleeves had been taken down, but even so his wrist bones were visible. The trousers showed the same problem. "Did they send you home early for being a disgrace to your uniform?" she asked. "They sent me home because—" He held up an envelope containing his report card. Sarah took it with a raised eyebrow and opened it. There was a note inside from the principal, commandant of the very expensive military academy she was sending him to. It told her that her son was an extraordinary student who had saved the life of one of his fellows while they were out on field maneuvers. The boy had been bitten by a snake. John had applied a tourniquet and had organized his squad to make a stretcher from their rifles and blankets, and then he had led them back to the academy. For this presence of mind, for his exceptional leadership qualities, and for getting straight A's, he was being rewarded by being sent on summer break early. "Congratulations," she said. Quiet pride shone from her eyes. He waggled his eyebrows and grinned. "Hey, I had a good teacher. I'm supposed to be like this great military leader, remember?" She hugged him again, knowing he didn't mean the teachers at the academy. "Exceptional leadership qualities, the commandant says," Sarah reminded him. "Nobody can teach you that." "Yeah, but you knew that before I was hatched," he said. "No problemo. It's just my nature." Sarah snorted. "Don't get cocky, kid. It's when you're taking bows that the world most likes to kick your butt." Listen, I'm kind of stuck here. She looked over her shoulder at the messy desk. Melinda's on break and in love. John laughed. You want me to hunt her down? No, I've still got a couple of things to finish up, but if you can entertain yourself until 1, I'll call it quits for the day and let Ernesto lock up. Great, he said. God, I'm dying of thirst. John went to the desk and picked up the glass of terere. This yours, Mom? He took a gulp before she could stop him. Ugh! He said, tears in his eyes. What did you put in this? He rasped. Battery acid? He waved a hand in front of his face. Oh! That's what you get for not asking permission, she said, coming over to the desk. Sarah took another drag of her cigarette and rolled her eyes at his disapproving glare. What? She snapped. I thought you'd given up smoking, he said. He looked disappointed. This is not my day, she thought. Every man I see is disappointed or disapproving. Then she felt a little brighter inside. She'd actually thought of her son as a man. I mean, after what you went through quitting last summer, I can't believe you took it up again. He shifted his stance awkwardly, then put down the terere. Come on, Mom, you're tougher than that. Sarah rolled her eyes. Okay. She tamped out the cigarette. But can we talk about this later, Sure, I'll go get a soda or something. Maybe keep an eye on Melinda. Sarah laughed. She'll probably use you to make this new guy jealous. Do you need money? Nah, I've got some. He looked at her for a moment, and then he reached over and gave her a peck on the cheek. See you in a couple hours. Bye. She watched him go, noting the new maturity in his walk, and sighed. Funny he mentioned the cigarettes, but not the caña in her tea. He would, though. She could rely on that. John walked down the dusty street with his hands in his pockets, listening to the conversations in Guarani and Spanish and several dialects of German, all of which he spoke, and acknowledging waves, a punishable offense on campus, so he did it every chance he got. Quite a difference from the days when I was ripping off ATM cards, he thought, with a twisted little smile. The extent of his crimes these days was making his jacket look baggy and maybe smuggling beer or cookies into the dorm. The air smelled powerfully of dry dust and the odors that went with being a cow town. The owners of the estancias around drove their stock here for the big semis to pick up. From here, he could see the green of paddocks, the gray-green thorny Chaco scrub, and the long sandy bareness of the road. Palms lined the road, rustling dryly in the heat. He passed the Confitena and, looking through the window, caught sight of a smiling Melinda in close conference with a guy whose vast black mustache dominated his thin brown face. He wondered if his mother might once have been such a girl with nothing more on her mind than clothes and guys. Melinda was a fairly pretty girl. Surely she had other options. John shook his head in puzzlement and moved on. His mother had often said that if women didn't have bad taste in men, there wouldn't be a human race. His mother. He could still feel the heat of the caña in his stomach. For a few seconds, he'd actually been lightheaded from the stuff. John felt the slow burn from an ember of resentment deep in his heart. They were not by any means so safe and comfortable that it was all right for his mother to sweeten her tea with 100 proof cane juice. He'd never forgotten the shock that had buzzed through him when he discovered that he was wanted for murder of his foster parents. I was 10 fucking years old, for Christ's sake. They'd been stabbed to death, both of them in the head. Even if he'd had the upper body strength, he couldn't have reached that high. Still, even he had to concede that it was not a completely unreasonable deduction, given his activities later the same day. And of course, a T-1000 made of liquid metal would be completely off their radar. So it had to be me, or me and Mom, that killed them. So what the hell was his mother doing slurping caña in the morning? Made him feel vulnerable and confused, and he hated that. Besides, the knowledge that his mother could have a weakness so human was disturbing at a deep level. All his life, she'd been a rock. He pictured himself putting her to bed, limp and soggy with drink, and he shuddered. I can't face that, he told himself. He'd come to rest in the shade of a tree, the park that was the center of the plaza before him. Several boys around his own age were kicking around a soccer ball and screaming curses and encouragement. John watched them play. He knew them all. Street kids, most of them, and very tough, who'd made him prove himself over and over until he'd convinced them that he was even tougher than they were. They'd gang up on him and win the day, but he'd seek them out when they were alone and they'd have a little one-on-one. He'd told them as they lay on the ground bleeding and panting, "Don't make me do this again." No one ever had. Instead, one day, they'd kicked him the ball, and that was it. He was in. In a minute, they'd notice him, tease him about his uniform, and invite him to join the game. And he would. And he'd enjoy himself. But he knew that some part of himself would hold back, would observe and evaluate everyone around him. Well, maybe it's the Terminators. Or maybe it was the way Mom brought me up, knowing I was supposed to save the human race from Skynet. My big fat fucking destiny to save the human race and send my own father back through time to save Mom. Maybe it was because he didn't have a destiny anymore. Not that he was going to complain if the world didn't go up in a ball of fire. Far from it. But he was pretty much restricted in what he could do and where he could go. He sure as hell couldn't go to college in the United States, now could he? As for achieving even minor notoriety here in Paraguay, he'd have to be very, very careful, lest someone from the CIA or something recognize him or his mother and start extradition proceedings. There were a lot of people hiding out here. It was a pretty easygoing country, and if he had some cash, nobody made problems. But it was one thing to let the kids of a bunch of Germans who'd arrived in 1946 linger, and another to annoy the US by sheltering a couple of genuine badass capital T terrorists. It shouldn't matter. It should be easy to let go of ambition, especially at 16. But all of his life, John had been told that he was destined for greatness, that he was born to be a hero. Now, he seemed destined to run a little trucking company and be a small-time smuggler. Definitely a blow to the old self-esteem. A self-deprecating smile tugged at his lips. Poor me, he thought to himself. Saved the world at 10, and I'm like, where do I go from here? It's all downhill. He grinned. John, you have to get over yourself. I mean, remember what you always thought of dickweeds who spent their time being sorry for themselves? Carlos, the youngest of the soccer players, saw him and yelled his name. The others turned and drifted over. Francisco Encinas, the tallest and the gang's leader, played it cool, looking John up and down. "All dressed up?" he said mockingly. "You going to a costume party?" John gave him a slow grin. "I just got home in time to see you kick that ball like an old lady," he countered. "Where'd you pick up those moves? You been folk dancing again?" The other kids chuckled, and Carlos did a couple of shuffling steps. Francisco gave him a playful shove. "Last time you played with us, you spent most of the time on your face in the mud," Francisco reminded John. "So, you gonna play or you gonna talk?" John took off his uniform jacket, folded it, and put it under the tree, dragged off his tie, and unbuttoned his shirt. "I thought you'd never ask." Sarah found him there, still playing a couple of hours later. She leaned against the tree beside his folded jacket and watched him. He was good, graceful, and deadly accurate. Much taller now. He'd be 6 feet or so when he was grown. Taller than his father, but then he hadn't grown up scrabbling for food in the ruins of Skynet's war of extermination. Darker than either of them, hair brown-black and cropped short now. His tanned face was sharp and his chin came to a near point. He'd never had baby fat, but now he moved like an athlete, his shoulders growing broad and legs long. The other kids scrambled to keep up with him. John noticed her and waved. She waved back. He said a few words to the others and ran over to her. "You don't have to stop," she said. "I'm perfectly content to watch." "Are you kidding? You saved me. I'm totally bushed. They got me at 5 this morning, and these guys could go on all day." He grinned at her, panting lightly. "I'm also starved." "Do you want to eat in town?" she asked. "Or can you wait until we get home?" "I wouldn't say no to some empty calories to tide me over," he said, "but I'd rather wait till we get home for real food. I miss your cooking." Sarah laughed outright at that. "Those are words I never expected to hear." "Don't sell yourself short, Mom," he said. "Nobody makes a campfire stew like you do. Nobody." John indulged himself with a banana split, the very sight of which made Sarah's teeth tingle. But at his age, Boys had hollow legs and could take the calories. Besides, at his school, they probably prescribed anything sweet that didn't come directly from a tree. He said around a mouthful of whipped cream. I've been imagining this since yesterday. Is it good? She asked. Almost as good as I remember. He licked the back of his spoon as she looked at her. You aren't much for sweets, are ya? Not ice cream for some reason, Sarah agreed. But otherwise, you're so rational. She laughed at that and then smiled at him. I've missed you. Missed you too, Mom. He waited until they were driving home to tackle some of the things that were on his mind. Do you mind if we don't go camping for a while? He asked. How long is a while? She asked. I wanted to go to Ciudad del Este before the end of next month. I've got a few appointments and I thought we could hit Parque Nacional Cagazu for a couple weeks or so and then swing up to the city. Sarah shrugged. We can go camping anytime, I guess. Why? Luis Salcido's family is having an asado to welcome him home from school, and we're invited. Both of us? Sarah asked. She was surprised and warily pleased. The Salcidos were a fairly prominent family in the area, but they'd never been more than polite to her. Yeah, John said. Luis and I really hit it off this semester. Sarah thought for a moment. He has a very attractive sister, hasn't he? She said at last. Am I that transparent? John asked with a grin. Transparent as in obvious, self-evident, unsubtle? Nah. Unsubtle? Moi? I never even looked at Consuela last year. She wasn't worth looking at last year. Harsh, Mom. True, but harsh. Sarah grinned. She'd missed bantering with him. So, when is this asado? She asked. Next Saturday. No problem, Sarah said. I couldn't get away myself before then. Maybe he doesn't want to go camping, she suddenly thought. They'd always done wilderness stuff to keep their skills sharp, or maybe just to keep from getting bored. But John was getting older now. He was of an age to want to make his own choices about how he'd spend his time, and who he'll want to spend time with. I suppose it's more healthy for him to want to spend time with friends and cute girls than with his mother. The proper thing to do, she supposed, was to let him choose the time and place for their trip, if he wanted to do it at all. Can we bring Luis along when we do go? John asked, watching her face. Absolutely, she said, relieved. Provided his folks don't object. If we wait a bit and let them get sick of him first, they shouldn't. Sarah chuckled. You know too much about human nature for a 16-year-old, she observed, only half kidding. You guys figure out where you want to go and we'll do it. Sarah gave him a brief glance and a warm smile. It'll be fun. After a moment, she asked, Does he have any equipment? I doubt it, John said. They're not much for the great outdoors in his family. I suspect his mother thinks camping is déclassé. I suspect his mother thinks I'm déclassé, Sarah said. John shook his head. I doubt she knows what to think of you, Mom. I mean, she's lived in Villa Hayes all her life. To her, you're the ultimate in exotic. Like, wow, you can drive a truck. That's so unfeminine. Sarah drove on, grinning. John gave her a weak grin. Fortunately, she's not invited. What about Consuela? She invited, Well, Mom, while that would make my vacation, and while she'd certainly be more than welcome, I think it's more likely that her parents would adopt me, or even you. Sarah laughed and shook her head. They do protect their girls. Mom, John said after a moment, did you ever notice how we both say they? She glanced at him. I mean, he shifted around in his seat until he was facing her. Wherever we are, we're not native, I guess. Not in the States, not here either. Not anywhere we've lived. There's us, and there's them. When do we get to be a part of them? For a few moments, Sarah looked straight ahead and just drove. Then she shrugged and tipped her head a bit. I don't know. I guess when we feel comfortable with the people around us. She shook her head. There's no easy answer to that one, John. Sarah flicked a glance at him. I wish there were, hon, but there isn't. Although, she wrinkled her forehead. And don't take this the wrong way, all right? But it's common for people your age to feel alienated. John rolled his eyes. Mom, cut me some slack here, okay? What I mean is that your feelings of alienation might be more pronounced right now, and that you should take that into consideration, even if everything in our lives was perfectly normal. You mean if my father wasn't from the future and we'd never even heard of the Terminators, never mind had to run for our lives and save the future? She tightened her lips. Yes, she said evenly with a quick sidelong glance. That's what I mean. You know where I'm going with this. Uh-huh. John sat forward again and waved a hand. It's one of those phases I'm going through. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the situation may be more painful because of a phase you're going through. After a somewhat hurt pause, she said, I've never brushed you off, John. I'm not about to start now. I know, Mom. I just wish... He stopped, too tired to go on. I wish too, hon. They were almost home when he brought up what was really bothering him. John watched his mother from the corner of his eye while he pretended to look at the road ahead. She looked worn. Her face had settled into a sort of irritated-looking softness, the result of trying to look blank while playing against the odds for half a lifetime, he supposed. He turned to look out at the passing landscape. Since the Terminator had shown up, revealing the truth of his mother's lonely struggle, he'd been in awe of her strength. Now, with the future assured, thanks in large part to her efforts, he was watching that strength crumbling away from lack of purpose. He understood and sympathized. How often had he lain awake contemplating a future that held no particular place for him? Frustration, loneliness, and sheer boredom were taking a toll on both of them. Sometimes the urges they prompted in him frightened him, but his mother seemed to actually be giving in to those urges. If there's one emotion he'd always recognize in himself and in others, it was fear. And right now he was genuinely afraid for his mother. So the question was, too scared to do anything about it? John shifted in his seat. Was he willing to watch her slide down that same slippery slope that beckoned to him out of fear or misplaced empathy? How long have you been drinking? He asked abruptly. Startled by the suddenness of the question, Sarah's mouth opened. She closed it without speaking, and they drove on for a full minute in silence. She could feel his eyes on her. Since I was about 15, she said. That's when I had my first beer. You know what I mean, Mom. She turned to look at him, frowning. John, don't try to parent me, okay? Hastily turning forward to steer the Jeep around a major pothole, she went silent for a minute. Today just sounded really tasty to me to have a little cognac in my iced tea. I don't do it every day. It wasn't that much anyway. Mom, it almost knocked me off my feet. With a grin, she said, It is potent, but there's maybe a tablespoon in there. I don't do it all the time, but once in a while, I like a little. Where's the harm? Sarah glanced at him. I don't get drunk, John, if that's what you're worrying about. Yes, that is what I'm worrying about. Aloud, he said, When did you start drinking it? When did you drink enough of it to recognize the taste after one swallow? She countered. Hey, I'm a teenager. We have our ways. Sarah sneaked a glance at him. He was trying to be cool, but she could see he was uncomfortable and unhappy. I had a really bad cold last winter. It just wouldn't go away. One of the drivers brought me a flask and said to add it to my tea. It'll clear it right up, he said. She turned to John. And you know what? It did. Must have been the pure alcohol running through your veins, John muttered. Or maybe it was the nicotine. Sheesh. No smoking, no drinking? Do you want me to join a nunnery or hire a chaperone? He looked at his lap, and then he returned to staring out his window. Sorry, Mom, he muttered. Sarah rolled her eyes. Sweetheart, she said quietly, we have to rely on each other, and we have to take care of one another. But that will go easier for both of us if we don't try to micromanage each other's life. John slid her a sardonic glance, which she could appreciate because she was focusing on the increasingly rough road. This from the woman who sent me to military school, he thought, where micromanaging lives is what they do all day, every day. Have you no shame, Mom? John stifled a laugh. He'd just have to watch her. He thought this behavior was new, but couldn't be certain. Their camping trip would be the perfect opportunity to find out just how far it had gone. A few weeks in the wilderness should dry her out nicely. Sarah lay in bed, smoking and thinking, staring at the rough plaster of the ceiling, and watching the smoke rise in curls through the moonlight, thinking that this would be one of her last cigarettes until John went back to school. Thinking about the girl she had been and wondering what kind of woman she'd be now if Kyle Reese and the Terminator hadn't come into her life. Just lately, she'd been sincerely regretting the loss of that girl, even while she winced at how clueless she'd been. Why me? She wondered for the millionth time. With an impatient grimace, she stubbed out her cigarette. Such thoughts were a waste of time. She knew she would fight the impulse to indulge them. But she was so isolated here that it got harder and harder not to wallow in self-pity. She punched her pillow and turned to a more comfortable position in the bed. Self-pity had never been one of her flaws before, and heaven knew she had reason to be happy. She was safe. More importantly, John was safe. The future, as far as she could tell, was assured. They had a nice, comfortable life here in Villa Hayes. They didn't even have to associate with much in the way of lowlife, except smugglers, and smugglers were quite respectable in Paraguay. A nice, comfortable, deadly dull, boring, empty life. She sighed. The girl she'd been would probably have found this life very fulfilling. She wished she could somehow achieve that attitude. She also wished she could have a little glass of cognac to help send her off to sleep. But John's obvious distress stopped her. The craving she was feeling right now stopped her. She'd be a fool to have come so far only to lose everything to demon rum. The only thing left in my life that means anything to me is my son. I will not lose his respect. So she'd just have to get used to going to sleep the natural way. At least she didn't have the nightmare anymore. For a moment, she ground her face into the pillow, as the thought brought back the images, the searing flash of white light as the bomb ignited, the burning bodies bursting apart as the blast wave struck them, her own body reduced to bones, yet still alive. Now, when she had nightmares, they were mostly of the asylum. Certainly, that was nightmare enough for anybody. That creepy asshole Douglas and his nightstick ratcheting against the doors at night. That was always a part of it. I hope I crippled the bastard, she thought. Killing was altogether too good for him. And Dr. Silberman, with his feigned compassion and understanding. Sarah grinned as she thought about the way she'd last seen him, pressed up against the wall with his mouth hinging open as the fluid form of the T-1000 went through the lockdown bars. I wonder how long it took him to convince himself that what he'd seen was some sort of mass hallucination. What a paper that would make. Go to sleep, she ordered herself. Not surprisingly, that didn't work. With a sigh, she got up, put on her robe, and went out onto the portal, the tile cool under her feet, the night alive with the sound of tropical insect life. She was startled, momentarily, to find someone out there. John? Hi, Mom. Can't sleep. That's my line. She sat beside him on the swing. I know you're worried about me, Sarah said. No need. A word to the wise, as they say. If it worries you, it's gone. Okay? He let out a long sigh. Thank you, he said simply. No problem. Well, it might be, but it would be her problem. No reason for John to know anything about it. They sat in companionable silence for a while, enjoying the soft spring night. Think you'll be able to sleep now? She asked after a while. Yeah. John was surprised to realize that he did think so. Me too. Let's go in and hit the hay. Good night, he said, and kissed her on the cheek. Good night, hun. So, what are you going to do today? Sarah asked, tearing apart a galetta and nibbling on the hot bread. The rolls were a breakfast favorite for both of them. So was the room, big and sunny, shady where it gave on the veranda. The Casa Grande wasn't actually very grand, about 80 years old, but built of whitewashed adobe and tile in a style much older. It had been the center of a much larger property once, but she'd bought only enough to give her privacy and pasture for a horse or two. John tipped his head from side to side with his mouth turned down. I don't know. Thought I might take Linda for a little exercise, if that's all right with you. No problem. She's getting fat and stir-crazy. Sarah took a sip of her mate. So, I'll leave you to your own devices for today. See, I think basically I'll just luxuriate and do nothing. Translation, everybody else I know is still in school. Well, she tipped her head to the side, except for that crowd of ne'er-do-wells that hang out at the plaza. John waved a hand. Nah, not in the mood. Sarah smiled a slow smile, and he pretended not to notice. You're afraid I'll put you to work. Not on my first day, he said. You wouldn't be so cruel. And I deny that I would ever think of you so, Mamacita. She chuckled. Mamacita. She looked off over the fields, grinning. Is that how you see me these days? Your good old gray-haired gingerbread baking little mama? The day I catch you baking gingerbread in a frilly apron, Mom, is the day I leave home. What you talking about gray hair? He gave her a look of comic disgust, and Sarah laughed. I do have something I have to ask you, she said. And I can't believe I'm asking this. How should I dress for the Salcidos asado? I mean, are we talking about a sitting on the hay bales kind of a do, or is it more like the barbecue and Gone with the Wind? John spread his hands helplessly, his face a study in amused disbelief. You can't believe you're asking this. I can't believe you're asking me this. How should I know? I suppose Luis will have his mom send us an invitation. Maybe that'll tell us. If we get an invitation, it's almost certain to be formal, Sarah mused. I mean, people don't send invitations for casual barbecues, she shrugged. At least they didn't in the States. I'll check with Luis when he gets home, John promised. He waggled his eyebrows. I don't want us to make a bad impression. Too late for that, Sarah told him sadly. But with the right duds, we might save the day. New clothes? He said. Me too. I'll expect you to work off the expense, she said with a mean-eyed glare. Muck out the stall? He said in resignation. Paint the trim, clean the chimney, clean the closets. I mean down at the company, Sarah said seriously. It's time we got you an official driver's license for one thing. And you need to know how the business works. That's another reason I'd like you to come with me to Ciudad del Este. You need to meet my contacts. John turned serious. I don't know if I want to do that, he said. He'd had more than enough of secret meetings in squalid rooms with people who genuinely gave him the creeps. We'd starve to death without the smuggling, hun. She tilted her head and studied him. Instinct told her that there was more at work here than just standard teenage rebellion. And it's not like we're bringing in guns or drugs. It's just stuff like computers and CDs and so on. Smuggling is what keeps this country running, John. It's like a huge, unofficial, unsanctioned national industry. Yeah, I know, but that's not the way it's always going to be, Mom. People like Luis want their country to get rich, and they know it won't happen by smuggling in everything they want. Things are going to change in the next decade or so, and I don't want either one of us to end up in jail. Sarah let out a breath, halfway between exasperation and admiration. You may well be right, she conceded, but I think we're intelligent enough to recognize the signs and get out of the business before they come to take us away. For right now, though, people rely on us, and frankly, they need us. At least we don't dump knockoffs on them. You're right, he agreed, falsely chipper. We may be criminals, but at least we're not murderers. Sarah rolled her eyes. I've got to go to work. We can continue this later, if you like. I'll be home around 6, she said, giving him a quick kiss on the forehead. The door slammed behind her, and she took a step, then leaned back to say through the screen, Welcome home, son. Love ya. Love you too, Mom. The waitress put down the barbecue beef sandwich with a smile. Ah, I forgot your terere, senora. I'll be right back. Sarah smiled and nodded. They knew exactly what she liked here. She didn't even have to ask. Of course they should know. She'd had lunch at the Confiteria just down the street from her business for the past 5 years. Sarah found it reassuring, almost a luxury to allow others to know her, even to this small extent. To her, it symbolized that her life here was free and above board. She picked up the sandwich in both hands. It was one big piece, hand-cut bread and juicy meat. Nothing fancy, but all very good. Sarah opened her mouth wide for her first bite. Her peripheral vision caught a Jeep passing by outside. The driver was male, no passengers. Adrenaline kicked her heartbeat into overdrive, and her stomach clenched like an angry fist. Her breath stopped as though she'd been suddenly plunged into cold water. Sarah froze with the sandwich almost in her mouth. I can't be having the DTs, she thought. I wasn't drinking that heavily. She could have sworn that she had just seen a Terminator drive by. She lowered the sandwich, struggling to swallow and breathe at the same time, and carefully turned to look out the window, down the street where the Jeep had gone. Flashback, she asked herself? The vehicle was still there. The driver was talking to one of the kids who hung out in the park. She couldn't see his face, but the general shape of him.
"Here we are, senora,"
the waitress said cheerfully, setting down an iced glass of terere. Sarah jumped and gasped, whipping her head around to stare at the waitress.
"Oh, senora, you're pale. Are you all right?"
Sarah swallowed and tried to smile. "Yes," she said. "I just thought I saw someone I knew." The waitress leaned toward the window, looking down the street. Sarah turned to look too, just as the Jeep started up again.
"Ah, that is Senor Van Rosbach," the waitress sighed. "What a kumbaye. Whew,"
she said, and fanned her face with her hand.
"You know him?"
"No," Sarah said and cleared her throat. She put down her sandwich. "He looked like someone I used to know." She frowned. "Who did you say he was?"
"Senor Van Rosbach,"
the waitress answered promptly.
"Hi, I'm surprised you don't know him, senora. He owns the estancia right next to yours. The old Strassner place."
"No," Sarah said. "I haven't met him. I was vaguely aware that it had been sold, but I didn't realize anyone had moved in yet."
"They say he's from overseas," the waitress said,
her eyes wandering to the window as though he might come driving by again.
"He's very handsome."
She looked back at Sarah and frowned in concern.
"Are you all right, senora?"
Sarah looked down at her sandwich. "I'm sorry," she said. "I can't eat this now. Why don't you just bring me the bill?"
"I'll wrap it up for you, senora. Later on you might be hungry, and there it will be."
She smiled down at Sarah, concern in her brown eyes.
"Your friend that you thought you saw, did something happen to him?"
Sarah nodded and sighed. "He died. In a fire."
"Oh, how terrible. No wonder you look so white. I'll be right back, senora."
Sarah's mouth lifted in a half smile. Funny how people react when they think you might explode emotionally, she thought. She rose and followed the waitress to the counter. "It was years ago," she said to the woman's back. "It's just that, out of the corner of my eye, it looked just like him for a second."
"See," the waitress agreed. "That happens sometimes, especially if someone has been on your mind a little."
She handed over the sandwich, and Sarah paid her bill. "Thanks," Sarah said. She left feeling a little better for the waitress's sympathy. She almost felt a little guilty, too, because what she'd said wasn't quite true. Boy, am I in bad shape today, Sarah thought. Other people see white mice. I see Terminators. She hurried to her office and walked up to Ernesto, whose legs stuck out from under a truck. "Hey," she said cheerfully. "I just found out I have a new neighbor." Her mechanic slid partway out from under the truck.
"That Austrian guy?" he said. "You just found this out, senora? He's been there for a month or more."
"So, fill me in," she said, leaning against the fender.
"I don't know that much," Ernesto warned. "People think he's rich. I've heard that he's doing some sort of business with Senor Salcido."
He shrugged and looked up at her.
"People seem to like him, and the women go crazy for him. Beyond that, I know nothing."
"Well, that's a lot more than I knew this morning," Sarah said. "I feel bad. I should have done the neighborly thing and welcomed him or something." She made a face. "I guess it's too late now. What's his first name? Do you know?" The mechanic narrowed his eyes in thought.
"Something really German. Dieter. That's it. Dieter von Rosbach."
"Thank you, Ernesto. I knew I could rely on you."
"I am not a gossip, senora,"
he said, looking hurt. "No, you're not," Sarah said over her shoulder as she walked away. "You're a man in the know." He raised his brows at that and smiled, then slid back under the truck. Sarah went into her office and shut the door. Then she booted up her computer and began looking for information. Von Rosbach's immigration record came up with his picture attached, and she swore softly. He looked exactly like a Terminator. Nice to know I'm not hallucinating anyway. An hour and a half later, she had some information, but not much. And what there was somehow just didn't quite ring true. Or maybe I'm looking for problems, she thought, chewing on a thumbnail. She hadn't felt this bad since she escaped the Pescadero mental hospital and was coming down off the Thorazine, and the nightmares were really bad. Could it possibly be a hallucination? A slight resemblance built into something more by her Kanya-deprived brain? Well, I don't like that thought. With a little shiver, she got back to work. The only cure for this was to find out more, and that passport picture is too unflattering to be a lie. That picture was of a face from the future. By the end of the day, she hadn't made much progress. Her Austrian neighbor was indeed rich, from a rich family. According to what she'd read, he had spent most of his life in the international society scene, attending openings, sunbathing on exclusive beaches, dancing at charity balls. He hadn't done much good with his life, but then he'd done nothing very bad either. There were no juicy scandals attached to his name, which, given the people he ran with, was something of a surprise. Perhaps he'd taken up cattle ranching as a whim, or as a way to connect with something real. I need a closer look at this guy, she thought. She wouldn't be able to rest until she did. But she'd have to be cautious. People who knew her in Villa Hayes would start speculating the moment she started asking questions. They'd have me planning a wedding before the day was out. There were pleasant things about living in a small town, but there were also annoyances. Neither of the other Terminators had bothered to build a background at all, let alone one as elaborate as this one. There had been nothing so delicate in their approach as moving in next door to their victim and making friends with the neighbors. So, does this represent a new approach by Skynet? Has it finally learned to be subtle? Now, there was a bone-chilling thought. On the other hand, this could be a coincidence. She'd never managed to become paranoid enough to believe that there was no such thing. But she'd become plenty paranoid enough to doubt everyone she'd ever encountered. Dieter von Rossbach could be nothing more or less than what his public record showed him to be, a rich playboy. So why have I seen this face before on top of the bodies of killing machines? That really was the crux of the matter, wasn't it? She knew she wouldn't be telling John. Not just yet, anyway. Not until she knew more. This had shaken her, if it hadn't actually frightened her. Sarah remembered her reaction at lunch. It had frightened her, all right. Information, she said to herself. I need to know more. Sarah rose just before dawn and dressed in the dark. Slipping quietly from the house, she went directly to the barn and saddled Linda for an early morning ride. That ride just happened to take her in the direction of von Rossbach's estancia. It was a little chilly. One of the few times in the Chaco you could say that the dry, clear air lost heat quickly at night. She felt guilty for not feeding the horse immediately, but it was early for her breakfast. It's only a 2-mile ride, she murmured to the mare as she tightened the girth strap. It'll work up a nice little appetite for you. Linda's ears flicked as though she were expressing some doubt about that, but she was a good-natured beast and took this strange departure from routine in her stride. A half-hour later, Linda was contentedly grazing and Sarah lay on her belly, her field glasses trained on von Rossbach's front porch, where, early as it was, the man himself sat with his feet propped up on the railing, sipping from a cup he held in one hand as he read a folded newspaper he held in the other. He's up pretty early for a playboy, she thought cynically. Then again, he might not have gone to bed yet. Or maybe he wasn't yet sick of his new toy and the demands it made of long and early hours. Von Rossbach sipped, von Rossbach read. Sarah watched. Eventually, she checked the time. Shit, she muttered. John would sleep in this week at least, she knew, so he might never suspect that she'd been out. But she had to feed Linda and get herself washed, dressed, and off to work. She pushed herself backward until she could stand without being seen by anyone in the house and jogged to where she'd left the horse. Riding home, she thought about what she'd seen. He'd sipped at the cup until it was empty. What does that prove? She'd never seen a Terminator eat, but they must. They weren't keeping that skin alive with batteries. And reading the paper was a reasonable thing for a Terminator to do. There would be a lot of useful information in one. But could a Terminator interact well enough with humans to be their boss? Sarah considered that and, with a sigh, concluded that with careful training, the answer was yes. After all, by the time they'd lowered Uncle Bob into the molten steel, she'd formed an emotional attachment to it. This was getting her nowhere, not even home. With a shake of her head, she kicked the horse into a trot. Maybe John sent another one back, she thought suddenly. That was a comforting thought. Or was it? If John had sent back another protector for his younger self, it meant that there was still a Skynet in the future. The idea sent a shiver shooting down her spine. Linda's ears swiveled back toward her as if asking what was wrong. Stop it, she ordered herself, then forced herself not to concentrate on how badly she wanted a cigarette or a drink. Sarah came into a kitchen, redolent of fresh brewed coffee and hot toast. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Glorious, she said. Opening her eyes, she looked at John, already seated at the table. "You're up early." "Look who's talking," he said, buttering his toast. "I was restless." John looked at her sympathetically. "You're doing great, Mom." Sarah snorted and reached for a cup just as the toast popped up. "That for me?" she asked. "It is if you wash your hands first." With a laugh, she went to the sink and began to scrub. "When exactly do we reverse roles?" she asked, looking over her shoulder at him. It's just for now, while you're going through nicotine withdrawal," he said, licking jam off his fingers. "I thought you could use the pampering. Don't get too used to it." "Thanks for the warning," she said dryly, flicking him with the towel. Then she kissed him on top of the head and moved off to claim her toast. "I do like my son," she thought,